All right, everyone, in this video, we're going to talk about a core concept that Max Weber uses to understand the modern world, and that concept is rationalization. It can be a tricky concept to understand, so you should really use your book. You should really use the writings, especially Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, to understand what he means by this, his writings on bureaucracy. But in this video, I just want to try to crystallize what it is that Weber is talking about when he uses this term rationalization. Again, it's critical to understand because it is for him the way that modern society is fundamentally organized. So let's try to figure this out. What I want to do first is I'm going to show you a series of images, a series of paintings actually by a painter named George Tooker. And I want you to just watch these images as they come onto your screen, and I want you to write down what words you associate with these particular images as they go. So let's take a look at some of these. Okay, so you should have written down some kind of adjectives or words that you think describe for us what sort of comes to mind as you look at these images. Now, usually when I do this, some of the things that students write down or say they sort of associate with these images as they come by is cold, heartless, impersonal, stale, isolating, alone, depressing, alienating, monolithic, anxiety. And if you just look at these images, I think that really represents what it is that Tooker is trying to represent with these. And you can actually see in the paintings themselves a lot of hard lines, straight lines, edges, a lot of boxes, and you kind of get an image of people being boxed into particular things, being cut off from one another, and the kind of alienation or the experience of anxiety and isolation that may come from that kind of a world. So I want you to sort of take those in mind, and I'm going to contrast these with another set of images also by George Tooker, so we can really see the contrast between what Weber sees as a rationalized world, which is the world that is represented here, and a non-rational world or non-rationalized world, which we'll look at in these images. So as these next set of images come by, I want you to again write down what words you see as associated with them. So again, looking at these images, it's a very different feel, and at least Tooker is trying to represent a very different set of emotions when you look at these images. Normally, students write things like warmth, intimacy, emotion, affection, togetherness, love, embrace. These are the kinds of words that we associate with these particular images. And so here what you can see is also very different artistically than the other set of images where there's interconnecting lines, bodies are interconnecting with one another, and that produces a feeling of warmth, of intimacy, and so forth. Now these are, I just want to use these as a way to set up what I think Weber's major point is in thinking about this concept of rationalization. These are contrasting images, and for us, we can think of them as the way that Weber contrasts modern society with those societies that have come before it. There's this move that Weber sees in modernity as we move from these non-rational motives that govern action and non-rational ways of organizing social life that are based on love and affection and tradition and feeling, and move into a modern world where life becomes organized for Weber around these impersonal, technical, efficient forms of structuring life. And that really becomes the contrast that I want you to see. So let's then think a little bit more about what this means. So what does rationalization then mean for Weber? And it's actually really difficult to come up with a clear definition of rationalization that Weber would use, because he actually uses the term in multiple ways across all of his writings. And so you can find different ways of using that. And then textbooks inside of sociology often articulate this in further ways that can sometimes seem contrasting. So I'm going to actually kind of just throw out as much as I can in crystallizing what Weber means by rationalization. For Weber, when he talks about rationalization, this is the increasing dominance of a set of values organizing life that we oftentimes don't even think about as values themselves. Efficiency, calculation, and predictability become the guiding themes of how we organize all of our social institutions. We order our entire social life through a means of calculating what is the most efficient way to get things done. We move into what he calls means-end calculation, where we only focus on what is the most efficient means to accomplish a particular end. And so this replaces, and this is important to see, this replaces for Weber what had dominated action and social life for much of human history, that was based on effective ties towards one another, towards family and kin and people that we're close to, action that is based upon emotions, and oftentimes really action that's based upon just traditions that we have that govern life. And so what's happening inside of rationalization is that all of those values are moving away, and they're being replaced by, you can think of the core value of efficiency. What is the most efficient way to get some particular end accomplished? And what's really, I think, important you'll see in Weber for this is that all other values get pushed to the side, so much that we don't even question what it is that the end is. What is the goal we're trying to seek? We just look for the most efficient way to maximize that particular goal, the most efficient way to maximize our earnings, the most efficient way for a society to maximize its gross domestic product, to become a more economically prosperous and productive society. And that becomes the overarching theme for a society. And all other values, all of our relationships with others, all of our maybe religious values, all of our moral calculations move to the background, and it's really about calculating the most efficient means to accomplish a particular task. Now, I want you to see this as a process, because Weber discusses this as a process. It's not a fixed thing. It's more of a process of moving to a more rationalized society. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not really an either or. There's sort of, you can imagine a kind of sliding scale of rationalization where on the one end you have a sort of completely driven by non-rational means, and on the other completely driven by rational means. And different parts of society can be in different places on that scale. You can imagine some, let's say, educational institutions, some universities that are more rational than others. You can imagine some religious organizations, churches, mosques, or synagogues that are more rational than other ones. And in the sense we're using rational here is focused on efficiency. And there's a whole architecture that gets built up around that, around bureaucracy and what he calls legal rational authority. So it's a continual process. Now, what you should associate, or what Weber wants us to associate rationalization with, is something that he terms disenchantment. And so disenchantment is to contrast the modern world, which is disenchanted, from all other societies that come before it, which are enchanted. And all he really means by this is that an enchanted world is one that is filled with mystery, magic, emotion, right? There's kind of magical forces that govern, spiritual forces that govern the world, and they're guiding things for good or for ill. And really a part of that too is that tradition and affective ties are governing social life in an enchanted world. These gradually are falling away in a rationalized world and being replaced with this sort of, again, cold, impersonal, technical calculations that take place. And so he describes that world and the human beings within it as specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. Technically really good at figuring things out, but completely amoral, completely devoid of any kind of emotion, and simply focused on those technical apparatus, technicians who just don't even bother themselves with morality or moral issues. And so for Weber, then you can think of the modern world becoming like a machine that's just sort of impersonally running on this algorithm, and we're just sort of churning things out over and over. It becomes cold, it becomes calculating, it becomes disenchanted. And again, inside of modernity, all institutions and sectors of society become rationalized over time. Even what can appear to us as the most effective, the most emotional forms of relationships in our families can be governed by these technical, impersonal forces. Think about, for example, the use of prenuptial agreements and the contractual obligations of marriage that we hang on top of what we often imagine as this purely emotional relationship built on love around a marriage. But inside of that is a whole set of legal, rationalized contractual agreements and arrangements on side of that. But even for Weber, and you can think about different ways that you see this, all of our economy for sure becomes rationalized, but art, music, architecture, religion, politics, all of these institutions become rationalized over time. So let's connect then this idea of rationalization to those images that we saw earlier, and try to think through what it is that where we see rationalization in our own world. I want to end with an important caveat here to help, because students get very tripped up with this often, to remind us that there are two important things you should not associate with rationalization in a Weberian sense. The first is this is not meant to be rationalization as a way to justify behaviors, right? We can talk about rationalizing my person's behaviors. My kids will rationalize their actions even when they know them to be wrong. That's not what we're talking about here. That's a different use of that term altogether. And you should not see rational as the opposite of irrational. Here the contrast is between rational and maybe traditional or rationalized and non-rationalized forms of social organization. But we often sort of build up rational as this thing we want to be, by which we mean using reason as a means to solve problems or to think through the world, whereas irrational is just sort of unpredictable and unexplainable and sort of completely devoid of any kind of reason or rationale behind it. That's not the contrast to look at. Again, the thing we're focusing on is rationalized organization, rationalized processes, processes that are governed by efficiency, calculability, predictability, technical aspects, versus those that are non-rationalized, focused on tradition, affective ties, things like that. All right, so take this idea with you. Let's see if we can figure out where we see rationalization in our own modern world.